When The Cable Guy released in the summer of 1996, it quickly became the most divisive movie in Jim Carrey's filmography during that era. All 5 of his previous films, while not universally loved by critics and movie-going audiences, were smash hits at the box office that cemented Jim Carrey's place as a pop culture icon. Jim's recent success gave him the freedom to enlist a few of his friends to work on the movie. Ben Stiller, who would direct the film, and Judd Apatow, who revised the original script and acted as a producer. This group of individuals took a movie once conceptualized as a goofy, lighthearted buddy comedy starring Chris Farley and turned it into a dark, slapstick comedy that a lot of people did not know what to make of. In today's video, we'll be discussing the development and legacy of The Cable Guy, not to mention how different the movie could have been with another comedic powerhouse as its star.
Once he gets plugged in, there's no stopping him. Jim Carrey, Matthew Broderick, The Cable Guy, rated PG-13.
Early on in 1995, first-time screenwriter Lou Holtz Jr. completed a screenplay for a film called The Cable Guy. At the time, Lou was a prosecutor for the Los Angeles District Attorney's Office who claimed that he was inspired to write the screenplay after seeing a cable company employee in the hallway of his mother's apartment building late at night. In that moment, he couldn't help but think to himself, what's he doing here so late? That internal dialogue led him to write a script that was, as Lou put it, a comedy about a needy cable guy you can't get rid of. This original script was reportedly a silly buddy comedy. Keep that in the back of your mind going forward. Upon completion, Lou passed his screenplay along to some producer friends who linked him up with a talent agency. The script then ended up in the hands of talent manager and producer Bernie Brillstein. After Bernie looked over that original screenplay for The Cable Guy, he immediately pictured one of his clients for the main role, actor and comedian Chris Farley.
You're gonna be doing a lot of doobie rolling when you're living in a van down by the river.
Like I said, all of this went down in the early part of 1995, so Chris Farley's star was rising faster than ever after the release of Tommy Boy in March of that year. Tommy Boy is truly one of my favorite comedies and one of my just favorite movies in general of all time.
Melted chocolate inside the dash, that really ups the resale value.
They have a thin candy shell.
I think your brain has a thick candy shell.
Your brain has the shell on it.
But once Chris Farley was eyed for the starring role, his manager took The Cable Guy script to various studios. A bidding war took place, and Columbia Pictures came out on top, purchasing the script for a total of $750,000, with an additional $250,000 going to writer Lou Holtz Jr. if the movie ended up being made. At that point, Lou took a leave of absence from his place of work and flew to New York so he could talk with Chris Farley face-to-face about his potential role in The Cable Guy. While researching this part of the video, it was hard to find a solid, reputable source to figure out what exactly happened when Farley was in talks to star in The Cable Guy. So I decided to use David Spade's 2015 memoir, titled Almost Interesting, as my main source of info for a lot of what I'm about to tell you. After looking over the script for The Cable Guy, Chris Farley was extremely eager to star in this film, and negotiations quickly began between his management and Columbia Pictures. At that point in time, production on The Cable Guy was planned for summer of 1995. The problem was, Chris had signed a 2-picture deal at Paramount, with Tommy Boy being the first of the 2 movies he was contractually obligated to do. When that deal was made, Chris Farley had publicly been in and out of rehab, so he accepted a smaller salary than usual in order to, as David Spade put it, get back on everyone's good graces and show that he was a team player. But after the success of Tommy Boy, Chris Farley was in high demand. Columbia Pictures was willing to pay him a salary of $3 million to star in The Cable Guy, which was, according to David, much more than either of them made on Tommy Boy. At that point, Paramount scrambled to find a script that fit the duo's comedic sensibilities so they could shoot the next movie of that 2-picture deal as soon as possible. Fred Wolf, who performed uncredited rewrites on Tommy Boy, was tasked with writing a complete screenplay under insane time constraints. The result was a 45-page script called Black Sheep, which was written in just a few days because Chris Farley and David Spade's contract with Paramount Pictures was set to expire. After reading the script himself, Chris Farley expressed to David Spade that he thought it was good, but it needed a lot of work. Paramount planned on beginning production on Black Sheep in summer of 1995, but Chris Farley insisted that they spend some time improving the script and delay shooting until summer of 1996. At that point, David had yet to read through the screenplay for Black Sheep, so Chris told him to look it over, and if David liked it, Chris would set aside his negative feelings and proceed with shooting Black Sheep that following summer. David found himself in a tough position because he was fully aware that if he truly didn't like the script, Black Sheep would be shelved for a year, and Chris would be free to go off and shoot The Cable Guy that following summer. But after reading through the screenplay, David truly believed that while Black Sheep wasn't perfect, there was a funny movie there. David was officially on board, and apparently when he announced his decision to Chris, it didn't go over well. Chris Farley was clearly upset that he would have to turn down The Cable Guy. But David said to him, "I'm sorry, but if you took Cable Guy out of the equation, I think you know this movie can be really good." David thought that he and Chris had the improvisational skills needed to refine the movie as it was shooting, and they could work with writer Fred Wolf during the production to make script changes on the fly. That didn't happen. Long story short, Tommy Boy director Peter Segal was unavailable to direct the movie, so the director of Wayne's World, Penelope Spheris, was brought on to direct instead. Penelope famously did not like working with David Spade. She intentionally kept him apart from Chris Farley for most of the film's shooting, and also fired Fred Wolf during production to bring in her own writer who David alleges threw out 40 pages from that original script and rewrote most of the movie. As a result, Black Sheep just really couldn't capture the same magic as Tommy Boy. It was panned by critics and regular moviegoers alike.
This is not only one of the worst comedies I've ever seen, but one of the least ambitious. It doesn't even feel like they're trying to make a good movie. Black Sheep is awful.
I have a confession to make. This is the first movie that I have ever walked out on in a theater in 26 years.
I envy you. I envy you.
I just want to make it clear that I do not agree with those opinions. I just wanted to show an example of the harsh criticism that Black Sheep received around the time of its release. I have a lot more to say about this movie, but I'll save it for a dedicated episode later on down the road. For now, let's turn the clock back to June of 1995, when The Cable Guy finally found its star. Now, I couldn't really find any concrete sources to back these names up, so take this with a grain of salt, but it's been reported that Adam Sandler, Paul Giamatti, Phil Hartman, and Robin Williams were also considered for the role of The Cable Guy. And even though David Spade convinced Chris Farley to star in Black Sheep instead of The Cable Guy, he wasn't completely to blame in this situation, because Columbia Pictures reportedly stopped pursuing Chris Farley for that starring role as soon as another actor showed interest in the part, the one and only Jim Carrey.
We got no food, we got no jobs, our pets' heads are falling off!
Before he was known as Jim Carrey, star of Dumb and Dumber and Ace Ventura, James Carrey made a name for himself as a stand-up comedian, and eventually became a principal cast member on the sketch comedy show In Living Color. Through his stand-up comedy, he met fellow comedian Judd Apatow, who eventually became known for writing and producing some of the biggest comedy movies and TV shows of the last 20+ years. While Jim was on In Living Color, Judd would help him come up with ideas for sketches. So when the first version of The Cable Guy's script made its rounds throughout Hollywood, Judd, knowing that Jim was attached to star in the movie, expressed interest in not just rewriting portions of the film, but also directing it. Judd alleges that the people at Columbia Pictures were willing to hire him as a writer, but absolutely would not let him direct it. But the studio had a list of potential directors, and Ben Stiller, coming off of the success of his directorial debut, Reality Bites, was one of the names on that list. Judd brought the script to Ben and convinced him to direct the movie. The pair had recently worked together on another movie that was panned by critics but turned into a cult classic, 1995's Heavyweights.
Get on the scale, son! All right. Get off the scale.
The news of Jim's casting was first reported on in June of 1995. And do you remember when I said that Chris Farley was offered $3 million to star in this movie? To star in The Cable Guy, Jim Carrey received a $20 million upfront payment plus 15% of every dollar the movie earned at the box office. That salary made like headline news at the time. People were shocked that he was getting paid that much money to star in a comedy film about an annoying, creepy cable installer. But Columbia Pictures was confident that Jim Carrey was on an unstoppable run of box office success, and The Cable Guy would be a summer smash hit. Before shooting began, Judd and Ben apparently visited Jim on the set of Ace Ventura: When Nature Calls to discuss The Cable Guy, specifically on the day when he was filming the iconic rhino scene. They spent a few days in a hotel room close by, brainstorming ideas for the movie. And this was apparently where Jim came up with the idea to give his character a lisp, a decision inspired by his Dickie Peterson character from In Living Color.
Who are you? Dickie Peterson, Cherub of Justice, here to protect and serve!
Production on The Cable Guy didn't start in summer of 1995 as planned, but rather January of 1996, about 6 months before its theatrical release. Jim Carrey's co-star in the film was Matthew Broderick, who plays a character named Steven. The film begins with Steven setting himself up in a new apartment after a recent breakup with his girlfriend, resulting from a failed marriage proposal. By the way, his ex-girlfriend Robin was played by Leslie Mann, and she actually met future husband Judd Apatow while auditioning for her role in this movie. During that audition, Judd had to read Ernie Douglas's lines while also imitating his lisp. Other actresses who tried out for the part were Jennifer Lopez, Salma Hayek, and Heather Locklear. But Steven has been expecting the arrival of a cable installer, who of course shows up right when he goes to take a shower. When Steven answers the door, he quickly reminds the cable guy that he's 4 hours late, which angers him because he's a little bit of a perfectionist. The cable guy quickly reveals that on top of his exuberant personality, he's a bit of a creep. He does some very sensual finger gestures to the wall while looking for a spot to install a cable hookup, and proceeds to ask Steven about his recent breakup, which he found out about by looking into his account information prior to his service call.
Your lady kicked you out.
Despite the fact that the cable guy called him a jerk-off and rearranged his apartment in a strange way to maximize his TV reception, Steven is friendly to him during his service call. That friendliness leads to Steven's downfall, when the cable guy, who reveals that his name is actually Ernie Douglas, but his friends call him Chip, begins to insert himself into Steven's day-to-day life.
Hey, buddy! Come on down!
He pulverizes Steven and all of his friends in a game of basketball, disconnects his cable while he's attempting to make up with his ex-girlfriend, and takes him out to dinner at medieval times, but promptly beats his ass in battle. Chip does occasionally do nice things, such as gifting him a bunch of electronics, or beating the shit out of Owen Wilson in a restaurant bathroom while he's on a date with Robin. But when Steven finally just flat out tells Chip that he doesn't want to be his friend anymore, the shit hits the fan. That stereo equipment that Chip graciously gifted to Steven was actually stolen, so he gets thrown in jail. When Steven continues to decline his friendship advances, Chip causes him to lose his job and threatens his personal relationships with family and friends. Meanwhile, Rick, Steven's actual best friend, played by a very young Jack Black, digs up some dirt on Chip and discovers that he's been using various fake names to mask his identity. Not to mention, he hasn't worked for the cable company in months because he was fired for stalking customers. The film wraps up with an absolutely insane scene taking place on top of a giant satellite on a rainy night, which concludes with Chip falling onto an antenna that, due to the camera's positioning, you're led to believe actually impales him. But when the camera pans up, it's revealed that he missed it by just a few inches. Oh, and a separate ongoing story involving the murder trial of a former child star has been being shown throughout the film. The cable guy's impact on that antenna causes all TV reception to go out the very second that the verdict is announced. The abridged version of the synopsis that I just gave you was obviously very much not a silly buddy comedy. In the months leading up to production, Judd Apatow, per the request of Jim Carrey, made several passes on the film's original script. The cable guy quickly went from silly buddy comedy to, as Ben Stiller put it, a comedy that satirized the psycho thrillers like Cape Fear, Hand That Rocks the Cradle, and Fatal Attraction. In an interview with the New York Times, the original writer of the screenplay, Lou Holtz Jr., said, "Carrey did not want to meet with me, did not want to give me any notes. I was told I was out as soon as the studio could make a deal with Apatow."
Sometimes you don't know what you've got till it's gone.
Jim Carrey wanted the cable guy to be a dark comedy because, as he put it, "I can't keep repeating myself. My audience is going to get bored. I can't keep making Ace Ventura. If I don't progress as a creative person, I'm going to go stale and the audience won't come anyway."
Alrighty then.
After filming completed, a preview version of The Cable Guy was screened for Columbia Pictures in March of 1996, and apparently it did not go over well. The studio and even some of the producers were, quote, dismayed by what they saw. Expectations of a silly buddy comedy predicted to be a summer blockbuster were not met. Apparently, Ben Stiller was pushed to make changes to the film before its theatrical debut, so some of the darker, more violent scenes were cut from the film. They were later included on the Blu-ray, and one of them is an extended version of the parking garage scene, which shows Chip actually getting run over, at which point he grabs onto the vehicle, and Steven is forced to swerve his Jeep in order to get him off of the roof. There's also a deleted scene that shows Chip chasing after Steven on horseback before their battle on the satellite dish that ends with a mud fight, and Steven is shown nearly crushing Chip's head with a boulder. Unfortunately for the studio, the film's release was locked in for June, and they refused to delay it any further. The film posters were printed, the preview trailers were cut, and the promotional 7-Eleven Big Gulp cups had already been manufactured.
Featuring special Cable Guy cups, now appearing at a 7-Eleven near you.
There was no time for reshoots. The The movie was going to release as it was originally made on June 14th, 1996. Ben, Judd, and Jim agreed that the entire process of actually making The Cable Guy was a lot of fun, up until the day it actually came out. Judd Apatow alleges that while he was attending the premiere of the movie, he was handed 2 reviews from Newsweek and Time magazine that absolutely tore the movie apart. Ben Stiller appeared on Late Night with Conan O'Brien with his father to promote the film on the day of its release, and even though you can clearly see that Ben was internally screaming thinking about all of the negative buzz surrounding his new movie, this clip is just absolutely incredible.
This guy, Matthew Broderick, who, he breaks, his girlfriend breaks up with him.
Sleep here, listen to this thing. They heard this already on Charlie Rose. They heard it with Gene Shalit. They heard it.
But The Cable Guy cost an estimated $47 million to make. On its first day in theaters, The Cable Guy knocked The Rock out of the top spot, but quickly dropped to the number 2 spot the very next day. By the end of its theatrical run, The Cable Guy made just under $103 million worldwide. The general rule in Hollywood is a movie needs to make about 2 or 2.5 times its budget in ticket sales to be considered profitable. Clearly, The Cable Guy fit the bill. It definitely wasn't a failure. But the news about Jim Carrey's salary, along with a broken streak of massive success at the box office and mixed reviews, made for a perfect storm. People were a lot harder on this movie because of those factors. Even though The Cable Guy was given a lot of flack around the time of its release, it's definitely gained a pretty sizable cult following. Jim returned as the character in a recent Verizon Super Bowl ad, and the Chip character was referenced in an SNL sketch back in 2014. Even though The Simpsons joked that The Cable Guy nearly wrecked Jim Carrey's career, that couldn't have been farther from the truth. An argument can be made that without The Cable Guy as a stepping stone from comedy to drama, Jim Carrey might not have felt confident about taking chances on movies like The Truman Show, Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind, or Man on the Moon. I also wanted to mention that Judd and Ben worked hard to include some of the best grunge acts of the time on the film's soundtrack. Although, unfortunately, as Judd stated on the movie's commentary track, grunge died like 2 months before the film released. And as far as the direction of the music industry around that time, he's absolutely right. Jerry Cantrell provided an original song called Leave Me Alone for the soundtrack, complete with a video that utilized unused footage from the nightmare sequence in The Cable Guy. Jerry's solo stuff is amazing enough on its own, but he's probably best known for his contributions as lead guitarist and co-lead vocalist for Alice in Chains. Alice's Unplugged album was released just a few months before The Cable Guy came out, and the band played their last show with Lane Staley on vocals just a month after the film debuted in theaters. Most people would point to those 2 events as the final nails in the coffin for grunge music during that era. But you can't help but wonder what the less dark, more silly Chris Farley version of The Cable Guy would have been like. Somewhere in the world, that original draft script still exists. I was hoping that the movie's novelization was based on that original screenplay, but unfortunately, it's almost identical to the completed film. Unless the original writer has a copy of his own, which I'm guessing he does, the only other copy of that original script is probably locked away in some Columbia Pictures storage closet. I'd imagine that the film would have been essentially the finished product we received, but without all of the dark, unsettling overtones. Also, having Chip bring Steven to medieval times for the dinner scene was apparently Jim Carrey's idea. So Chris Farley's Cable Guy probably would have brought Steven to like Sizzler, CC's Pizza, or Chuck E. Cheese. Funny enough, while I was doing research for this video, I found a picture of Jim Carrey and Chris Farley together outside of the Kids' Choice Awards in 1997, where Jim actually won the award for Favorite Movie Actor, because kids had better taste in movies than critics back in the 90s. Anyway, I thought it was cool to not just see 2 comedic legends in a photo together, especially considering that Chris would pass away just about 8 months later, but also the potential Cable Guy next to the actual Cable Guy. But when I was looking at this photo, I thought to myself, who is that goofy guy in the background staring at the camera like a deer in headlights? When I zoomed in and realized that it was Judd Apatow, I could not stop laughing. But that'll do it for today's episode. I hope you enjoyed it. If you have the time, please leave a comment down below. It really helps the channel. And I'll probably reply to you if you're not a complete jerk off! As always, thank you for watching, and I'll see you on the next one.